First of all, I'd like to thank PCCGB for the opportunity to present here this morning about a 19th century, late 19th century darkroom. Also, I'd like to thank the people at this place, which is Strokestown House, which is in County Roscommon in Ireland. It's in the northwest Midlands of Ireland, 145 kilometres northwest of Dublin. In the 19th century, it would have been an estate of 27,000 acres, believe it or not. It was a vast estate, and the people there were very wealthy. They were Anglo-Irish, which meant they were both British and Irish. Most of the family there would have been born in Britain. In fact, some of them died there, and I will elaborate on that. It was owned by the Anglo-Irish Mahan and Pakenham Mahan families. In 1847, there was an unfortunate occurrence. Major Dennis Mann, who was the owner of the estate at the time, thought it'd be a good idea to evict people during the famine and make them walk 145 kilometres to Dublin and then get ships to Canada. A lot of them didn't make the journey. A lot of them died along the way. So one of the tenants decided to go and shoot him. And he was the grandfather of the photographer, Henry Pakenham Mahan. So following this little bit of trouble, Henry Pakenham Mahan's mother, Grace Mahan, had married a man called Henry Sanford Pakenham, and she moved to the Isle of Wight, where Henry was born in 1851. Here's Henry, and that's his darkroom. I'll show you more pictures of it. His darkroom looks like it came out straight out of IKEA or B&Q. But in fact, it is a 130-year-old wooden structure built inside the anteroom to his gentleman's study. He was classic in many ways of the Anglo-Irish ascendancy landowning class at the time. He served in the British military. He was a captain in the Scots Guards. He was a High Sheriff of County Roscommon, Justice of the Peace, and Deputy Lieutenant of County Roscommon. All of that is actually relevant to what you're going to see in his photographs, because the attachment to Britain, the British military, etc., was very strong in his family. So the structure of the presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about the significance of the darkroom and the photography collection. I'll give a brief history also of who else was doing photography at the time in the big houses in Ireland around. And there are, for anyone who's researching darkrooms, there are several darkrooms here in Ireland, one of which is still extant, and I'll show that. Just examples of his equipment, cameras, etc. Most important thing, though, was I went here last winter in the middle of the snow. I had been looking at a camera collection in the west of Ireland, and I was on my way back to Dublin, and I knew that they had restored in the darkroom in Strokestown House for basically the centenary of the death of Henry Pakenham Mahan. So therefore, I felt it was a place I should visit. There was also, according to a cataloguing that had been done in the 1990s, supposed to be a grub lens there. And anyone who knows me knows that I collect the Irish-made grub lenses, which were made in Dublin in the mid-19th to late 19th century. So in addition to that, then, I'm going to show some examples of the image. And I can only show a very few images because there's a vast amount of photographs, mainly glass plates, in the collection. And also the books contain an awful lot of records. So you're going to see an edited selection. The photographs, of course, are historically significant because of the time that they illustrate, etc., time which is maybe up to 130 years ago, which was being recorded. The main thing, though, is that the combination of having a darkroom, having the cameras, having the notebooks and the photographs all together in the one place from up to 135 years ago is remarkable. For anyone who is a photographic historian, this is a major find and a major, basically, instrument that can be used to study not only Henry Pakenham Mahan and his family, but also what photography was like for photographers back then. So I'm going to begin at the beginning, as they say. Photography in this area. About 40 kilometres away from Strokestown is a town called Edgeworthstown. And it's actually named after the Edgeworth family. And this woman here is Maria Edgeworth. And she was born in the 18th century in 1768. This is a photograph of her taken by Richard Beard in Regent Street. In his studio, he had the daguerreotype license for England, as we know. And in 1841, there is a marvelous description by Maria, what it was like to have what she called her likeness taken at that time. Well worth anyone looking up. Her half-brother, however, was a man called Michael Pakenham Edgeworth. So you might notice the same name. Michael Pakenham Edgeworth, however, was not related to the Pakenhams. He was named after one of the best friends of Maria. Maria was a well-known author, and her book, Castle Rackrent, was a major bestseller in the early 19th century. But her best friend was a lady called Catherine or Kitty Pakenham. And the amazing thing, by the way, is that Maria's father married 4 times. And her youngest brother here was 44 years her junior. Kitty Pakenham was the wife of another famous Anglo-Irish person who you've all heard of, and that was Arthur Wellesley, the Duke of Wellington. Kitty Pakenham was also the sister of the great-grandfather of Frank Pakenham, who we all know better as Lord Longford, or as the British tabloids used to call him, Lord Porn, back in the day. Anyway, Michael Pakenham Edgeworth was a photographer, and here's his first efforts as a calotypist. They're very faint. They're of a house, not the Edgeworth house wasn't near as big as that of the Pakenham Man's. It's only 40 miles away. Unfortunately, he didn't continue as a calotypist. He mixed around with people like David Brewster. He went to India and spent most of his life there as a botanist. Next photographer up here, and there's 2 women photographers coming up now. First is Mary Ross, who is the wife of the Earl of Ross in Birr, County Offaly, which is not very far away either. She was an early photographer, and she's many different techniques, everything from daguerreotype, wet plate, to calotype. And in fact, she won the prize of the Photographic Society of Ireland for paper negatives in the late 1850s. This is a photograph taken of the largest telescope in the world, which was built by her husband, William Parsons, the Earl of Ross. She was helped, they were helped by a man called Thomas Grubb from Dublin, whose name will come up again. I've mentioned it already. And in addition to that, she also put her own input into this, in that it was her money. She was actually from Yorkshire, that built the telescope. She was an heiress. And in addition to that, she was a good blacksmith. The little boy down beneath the governess there is Charles Parsons, the inventor of the steam turbine. So here's her darkroom. The darkroom of Mary Ross is at Birr Castle. It is supposed to be, now I use the word supposed to be, the oldest surviving darkroom in the world, in that it was used from the 1840s onwards. However, it is not in the location where it originally was. It was moved out of the castle some years ago by the Parsons family and moved into what they call a science block, which is beside the main path. Henry Pakenham Man's darkroom is exactly where it was in the 1880s. Now, there's a darkroom in this picture, and you're probably wondering where it is. It's actually the house behind, known as the Photograph House, which still survives today, and I'll explain this one. There's another connection here with Roscommon, County Roscommon, in that there's a woman called Augusta Crofton Dillon. She was born in Moe Park in County Roscommon at Clonbrock Estate in Galway. She married a man called Luke Dillon, and this picture here is taken in Galway at Clonbrock House. The house, unfortunately, is burnt down, but the photograph house still exists. This was during the wet plate era. And what Augusta would have had to do was, immediately she had taken this photograph of her finely coiffed friends and relations, she would have had to rush in that door before the wet plate dried out and have her photograph developed. It's unfortunate that the house got burnt down that's the main house, got burnt down in the 20th century. This building still exists. It was used recently for our Irish language channel here to make some films about the history of Irish photography. So we're moving on now to the dry plate era, and this is the era in which Henry operated. I'll explain about that as we go through. You're going to hear a lot about dry plates. This is just a photograph taken in Cork for a man called William Lawrence in Dublin. The photographer was a man called Robert French. So he would have been able to take this in Cork, go back to Dublin and have the plate developed there. This is Richard Mallock's development of about 1871. However, there were issues with dry plates, and I will refer to those as we go along. In the 1880s, when Henry started, film had arrived. Here is the Kodak number 1, George Eastman, etc. There are film negatives in Strokestown. However, they're not in great condition. They're from a slightly later era, maybe between 1910 and 1920. Henry actually appears in some of the images. And I'm not going to deal with that because I'm just going to concentrate today on the glass plates, which have been scanned. Some of the negatives have also been scanned. There is one little twist, though, about film, which I will deal with towards the end of my talk. The main thing is that Henry Pakenham did all of his photography on his own. He was never a member of a society, such as this august group. Now, this picture is much earlier. It was taken in 1856 in Dublin, of the then Dublin Photographic Society, which later became the Photographic Society of Ireland. He never joined that group. So all his photography was done completely by himself. These people were of a similar class to himself. The man sitting in the middle at the table is Sir John Jocelyn Coghill. Behind him is Lord Otto Fitzgerald. And beneath Otto Fitzgerald is a man called Thomas Grubb, whose name again arises and will arise again. Every year, Henry went to London on his holidays, basically for the summer season, for Henley, etc., whatever else was going on at the time. I'm not sure whether the summer season was the same back in the 1850s or the 1880s as it is today. This is the Royal Photographic Society on an outing, all, again, gentlemen, same class as Henry. And on the left-hand side, wearing a soldier's hat is Roger Fenton, one of the founders of the Royal Photographic Society. So he never joined up with them. There's no evidence either that he had a darkroom in London. And that's important for part of the story I will show you with the photographs later on. So when I said he operated on his own, here was his note to his servants, which says, "Do not open this window. It damps my chemicals. When wanted, I will open it myself." A remarkable thing for a gentleman of that era who would have had many servants in his house. According to one of the census returns, his mother had 11 servants in her house. In Strokestown House, they actually had a gallery kitchen, which meant that the man or the woman of the house could issue instructions about the cooking of the food without having to enter and mix with the servants in the kitchen below. So this was a remarkable comment. So what was he talking about? Oh, what he was talking about was this. Here's the relevant window with the blind open. This is the curved windows which are on his study and also on his anteroom, which contains his darkroom, which is on the left. As I say, it looks like something from IKEA or B&Q, but it's original from the 1880s. You see a red filter in the window there, and there's also some kind of a platform outside that window. But these were the windows which the servants were not to open, the blinds. So here's the safe light effect with the external window. There were around at the time, I found this through going through the collection of the Photographic Society of Ireland, there were paraffin lamps and others that could be used as safe lights. But it appears that he used this as a safe light. He had a red filter in the window. There's also a green filter there. It may appear in some of the photographs, which I show later on. But the situation is that this is how he did it back then. There was no electricity in the house until 1911. He had quite a collection of glass dry plates. I'm just showing you here a list of everything that was available, and he had a few that are not on this, such as the 3 1/4 by 3 1/4 Magic Lantern plates. These are still here today. Here are the different plate sizes in his arsenal. The sizes used are indicated in the notebooks. And here you'll see that he's full plate, half plate, quarter plate. One of his favorites was Ratton and Wainwright's Ordinary, which he called WWO. And over here, there is what he called M&S, which is Mawson and Swan. When I first saw it, I thought it might be Marks and Spencer's, but it wasn't. Just at the top, there are, finish on this image here. He had somewhere between 60 and 70 different chemicals. He'd all the usual ones: caustic soda, ferrocyanide, quinol, etc. He made up his own solutions, and you'll see evidence of that in a few minutes. And down below at the bottom, you can see his paper, etc. So the plates are either marked with sensitometer rating, or as this one here is marked with Hurter and Driffield. I'll deal in a few minutes with the issue of how he dealt with exposure back then. There are also sensitometer ratings on the Ratton and Wainwright, which are to the right. This would have been about, my estimation is this is between 2 and 4 ISO in today's money, or maybe around 3. So there was a substantial number of exposure systems back in the 1890s. They weren't standardized until well into the 20th century. And a lot of people on this call or watching this will know this. For example, on this table, which is from 1952, BSI, ASA, H&D, DIN, American Shiner, Western, GEC, European Shiner. So there you have, what you have is a something that is today eliminated with ISO and our standard aperture system. He used exposure tables. I looked around for these, things like the Wynn's infallible exposure meter and the Watkins B meter, where you would match the 2 bits of paper and time it, etc. But there was absolutely no sign of them. However, I did find this. I found the central tube of an earlier Watkins actinometer, and in his study. However, the rings with the numbers were missing, and there's no reference to the use of this in his notebooks. This are his notebooks. I'm going to go into a section about this now. I have not been able to find any reference online to Burton's notebook for photographers, so I'd like feedback for anyone who's actually seen one of these. It dates from 1888. And was published by Piper and Carter of Furnival Street in London. Here's the first table, which is inside. This is a table where you actually see that he actually wrote on this, which kind of makes it significant. Here he noted various focal lengths. There are what appear to be light levels down the left-hand side. And this is the size of the aperture. Interesting, they're using decimals. Here in inches. So here, I don't believe he actually wrote this. This is when he got the book, I'd say HBM. That's how he always referred to himself. Henry Pakenham Man, May the 19th, 1888. Here he has written down those dimensions in respect of a number of his lenses, which he had at the time, a Watson Rapid Rectilinear, a Dalmar, I think it was an anastigmat signal, and a Watson wide angle, WA, which he used a lot. And here he has those numbers, which he'd taken from the other table, and he's written in the aperture scales. I will deal in much more detail later on with the aperture scales. Table 2 in your Burton's book, and he has written some things on top there. You actually see 16 and 0.32 inch, which may be referring to his Watson wide angle lens. These are a bit like Kodak tables, things like sea and sky, open landscape under a tree, etc. It's a rather confusing table to read because it starts in fractions of seconds, then it goes into minutes and seconds, and then hours and minutes, and then back to seconds and minutes and seconds. So it's a somewhat confusing one. You'll see the brackets on the left-hand side there. A is for portraits, and B is for rapid view, and C is for landscapes. And here you'll also see the beginnings of what we understand as apertures today. For example, see 5.657, etc. So the standard aperture scale still hadn't come in, and I'll say something about that in a few minutes. The plates which are there, there's no indication, obviously, on the plates of what make they are, but we know by referring back to the book, the notebook, what plates he used, whether they were Mawson and Swan or Ratton and Wainwright or Wellington or whatever. They're well stored, they're scanned, and they're there. Some of them are negative and some of them are positive. And as I mentioned earlier, there's also some film negatives around. On to the next page in the Burton's book. Again, interesting because they actually wrote on it. The rapidity of the plates available at the time, again, standardized systems. This was probably written just before Hurter Driffield actually took off. And there are sensitometer ratings here. And one was a standard one in this book was 17 or 18, which equals to 1. And then you work down into fractions for slower plates and into multiples for faster plates. He has an interesting comment here, just at the bottom here, that a lantern plate of a sensitometer rating of 5 is 1/40th of rapidity. So there he was obviously looking into a situation with lantern plates. And then finally, there is a reference in the top about the increase in focal length of a lens where objects are being photographed must be additional exposure that needs to be taken into account. Now, there's this table here. I'm not going to dwell on this. This was table 3. These appear to be down the left-hand side. You have what are obviously focal lengths, and across the top, you have what I believe is plate rapidity, starting with a figure of 1 for the 17 to 18, and then down into fractions for slower ones and up into multiples for faster ones. There's no indication that he ever actually used this table. So on to cameras. I'm just going to show one of his cameras here. It's an 1890s Lancaster Instantograph. It's a quarter plate camera, has a Thornton Pickard time and instant shutter, and it has a Dallmeyer lens, which is suitable for 3¼ by 3¼ But before we actually look closely at the lens and what he did with it, we need to look at the mess that apertures were in back in those days. Just as had happened earlier with plates, there had been attempts by people like the Royal Photographic Society, as it were, to unify and standardize something that started around 1882 about aperture, and but it wasn't a great success. They were also looking at things like lens mounts. Interesting in that it took many, many years for standardized lens mounts to come in, and people like Leica with their screw mounts, etc., it maybe kind of set a standard, but then everybody else wants to go their own way. Anyway, moving back to apertures, here down the left side, you see again the beginning, you see 5.66, etc. Then you see the US system of and then Ross had adopted it, a British manufacturer. So you'll see that they join up at f16 there. Then if you go across to the center where the double lines are, just to the left of that, you see Dallmeyer. And this lens was a Dallmeyer. And Dallmeyer had a system, which I think from about the late 1860s, it was an option on Dallmeyer lenses, that you could have a diaphragm. And here you see 15, 20, 25, and 30. And you see where 16 lines up with that. Here we have the lens. It may be difficult for people to read this, but between 25 and 50 on this lens, you'll see f16 scratched by Henry. This is significant, but just to say that f16 was between 25 on a Dallmeyer, which was 15.81 on the new scale, and 50, which was 22.36 on this lens. He scratched this in. The significance is this, is that he shot everything at f16, which I don't blame him for doing. When I was younger, there was an old adage which was f8 and be there. Well, in Henry's case, was f16 and he was there. This is just a first glance at the book. What I would suggest when I'm talking about the book, I will try and point out as best I can the what I'm talking about on the book, because there's an awful lot scribbled into this and it's very difficult to read and you might damage your eyes looking at this. But going from left to right, there is the number of the slide or number plate. And there's the date, October 15th, September 28th, and so on. Then there's the hour, and this is important. Everything in the book was shot between 12 o'clock and 3 o'clock. And there was a reason for that, and I'll explain it in a minute. Then he always took what the light was, and then he's poor, good, very fair, etc. Then he had the description of the plate. Interestingly, this was written in 1918, but he was using a Mawson and Swan plate that he had bought in September 1907. So there must have been good life in those plates. Then there was the lens, and here obviously my interest is aroused again because I see grub. Down beneath there's GZ, which is Gores. He started to use German lenses. And then stop according to US. Well, that was just what was in the book, but he shot everything at f/16. Then coming onto the right-hand page, there are the subject matter, and then the exposure times. You'll see 35 seconds, 40 seconds, 40 seconds, 70 seconds. So as soon as I saw this, I said, well, he's not shooting outdoors. Occasionally he has, on the final right-hand side, some comment about chemistry, but it's very inconsistent. He has, for example, down here about his developer, good, strong pyro, weak soda. So I'm not going to get into that, and I'll show you why in a minute. Just to finish off on the grub lens, this lens on the left is possibly the reason why I went there. I was looking for a lens like this. These two belong to a friend of mine in the UK. These are grub aplanatic doublets. And the one on the left side has been adapted with a diaphragm. And according to the cataloguing, which was done in the 1990s, the lens in Strokestown had such a diaphragm. The one on the right-hand side is as originally was, with a slot for a water-out stop. The most important thing about these lenses, of course, and Strokestown, is that these lenses were made in Ireland, and Strokestown is in Ireland. There were all kinds of dark slides. I won't dwell on this, but they're all over the place in full, half, quarter, and other different sizes. One of the most lovely things that are in the darkroom, I thought I'd show you these, are these lovely granatine porcelain dishes. They're absolutely fabulous and in beautiful condition, and they have a lovely lip there for pouring out the liquid. Here's a glimpse inside the darkroom. Again, you can see the wooden structure, which you've seen twice already. There are water cisterns in there. I asked about when running water had been supplied to the house, and they weren't sure, but they said there had been a well below the house in the 19th century. And as I say, there was no power until 1911. There's other things there. There's a printing frame you can see. The thing the printing frame is in fact a wooden sink, and there's various other bits and pieces. Something perhaps more interesting inside, which was discovered only about 6 weeks ago. I went down to give a talk for Irish National Heritage Week in August, and I had them looking for various things around the darkroom before I went in, and they discovered this. This was only discovered this year, 2023, and this is writing by Henry. It's his own very distinctive writing of his chemical formulae, which he possibly wrote in maybe the early 1890s. And you can just about make out there potash, pyro, normal exposure. I'm not sure what that symbol is. If anybody has an idea, I'd be glad to hear it. Whether that's 1 ounce or 1/3 of each solution, 2/3 water or 2 ounces water. And then glycine is over the other side. And there's various other pieces of writing like this. What I really don't know, what I'm trying to figure out, is how Henry was able to read his own writing on the wall like this, because it is a very dark room. The most important thing actually in the darkroom area is this item here. I call this number 1 witness for the prosecution. It's an enlarging or copying easel, and those pins are actually appear in some of Henry's pictures. So this has been around since the 1890s, and it's an important piece of evidence for what he was actually doing. So now for the really interesting stuff, the notebooks and the photographs. There are three main notebooks, two for full and half plate, one for quarter plate, and there's some loose notes, which I will also show you. Some of the images are mentioned in both a full plate, half plate notebook, and also in the quarter plate notebook. I'm not going to show the quarter plate notebook. It's it's a small notebook, and his writing is very tiny in it, and it's hard enough to read his larger notebooks. The quarter plate notebook also includes 3 1/4 by 3 1/4 images. Some of the images and the dates appear more later than the date in which the image was taken, which meant he was processing and reprocessing. And in most cases, a plate was made from a print, which is interesting, of what's in the notebook. The notebooks contain his darkroom images. The images he took in the darkroom or in the darkroom area are processed there, and not ones which he had taken outdoors. And again, as I emphasized, the photographic work was done around the brightest part of the day, but after the sun would shine in, because his darkroom and his study windows are east facing. So after about 12 o'clock, there will be no direct sunlight inside. The whole question about the light sources and diffusion, I will deal with later. So here we're starting into the notebooks. As I explained earlier, it is very difficult to actually show a large selection from this. We'd be here till Christmas. So what I've done is I've chosen photographs which are significant about the man and about his working methodology and about the culture and background that he actually came from. I think that's important to record those. Here, 1898, and here we have, under the subject, we have regimental dinner, and this took 2 minutes, a Mawson and Swan full plate, using the Watson lens. And down below, we have, just directly beneath that, is Olive Cabinet twice. So I'll explain what these are about. Here's a photograph taken in 1898, October 1899. It's a officer's dinner of the Scots Guards somewhere in England. Very well lit scene, actually, for the time. We know Henry didn't take it because the man there with the spot on his face is fifth from the right facing is Henry. So obviously, to my mind, he got a print of this. They were all given a print going as part of as a souvenir, and he brought it back home, and he decided he would want to make a copy of this to show to his friends here in Ireland, to show what a dinner he was at, who he was with, Sir this, Colonel that, and all of that kind of thing. He loved, by the way, in his collection, there's a lot of photographs of things like generals sitting on horses. So the British military tradition is very strong, was very strong in that family. And this was produced as a full plate negative. We haven't found that many prints of this lying around. So, but one must assume that that's what he actually used this for. Here's Olive Cabinet. And of course, I was looking for a cabinet, but then I should have kicked myself. Of course, we're talking about a cabinet card, 4.5 by 6.5. And it was made into a positive square plate, possibly for a magic lantern projection. It's a lovely picture of Olive. She's about 4 years of age in this. She was born in 1894, and this is probably taken around 1898. The white line down the left-hand side is significant, and we'll return to that later. So here we have Olive was his daughter, and May was his wife. And here we have May profile with a circle. And then down below, May oval fuller face. And he liked the May oval fuller face best. There's also a little comment down here in the bottom right-hand side, slide open trial, 2 hours, good in camera. I'll talk about that later on because I was looking for whether or not he was ever using solar camera. So here's the one from the circular profile series. By the way, the image of Olive was almost certainly taken by himself. So that was one of his own images. You'll see some images here in the question. There will be a question of whether he took the original or not. The original in this case looks like it was very professional standard. And this looks like a photo. And even the circular frame that's on it is looks like it's done professionally, and this was done as a positive for projection. He liked pictures of ladies in profile, by the way, so you'll see another one later on. Here's the one of his wife, May. By the way, his wife was the daughter of a British colonel, so the military tradition ran very deep. This was produced as a positive also for Magic Lantern, and there's a full print of this in the house with no mask. And we looked at it when I was down doing the presentation, and I showed it around to a few people. I believe that this was done professionally. I believe that it was done with possibly by a studio whose name is going to appear in a minute. He really liked this, and he worked on this, and I presume it was because also his wife liked it and she wanted to show it to her friends on the Magic Lantern. Now things start to get interesting with this picture here. This is Olive, and she's about 5 or 6 in this. Among the things you can see is at the top, you can see those pins on the copying easel there in the picture. And down on the bottom left side here, you'll see Lafayette. Now, Lafayette was a branch of a firm called Lauder, who were here in Dublin. The people were born in County Offaly, but the family had originally come from Scotland. And in 1885, Princess of Wales was in Dublin, and Lafayette was kind of a posher French thing. James Stack Lauder called himself Jacques Lafayette when he was pretending to be French, when he was taking these posher photographs. Anyway, the Princess of Wales had her photograph taken in Dublin in 1885, really loved it. And Queen Victoria then invited Lauder over to Windsor Castle, where he took her photograph. And this led to a royal appointment and to them opening in London and all over Britain. And they were a great success. Their most famous photographs were taken in 1897 for the Queen's Diamond Jubilee at the Devonshire Ball, where people dressed up as Marie Antoinette, etc. So you see this kind of fashionable Rococo style, which is here. There are prints around the house I've seen, which are made from a negative plate, and which were made from this, but Lafayette has left out of them. So I doubt he was passing them off as that. He just probably felt that the frame took away from it. Ladies in profile again. One of the things that Henry liked to do is, first of all, he was quite an artist himself, and he took photographs of his own drawings too as well, and some of them were saucy drawings, and some of them had French commentary underneath them. So you'll see where that's going. In this case here, there's a woman called M. Hill, and I believe she's possibly an actress, and that they had seen on their summer sojourn. They used to go over for the summer season to London, and this is beautifully taken with rim lighting, etc., by somebody. So here's Henry making a copy of it. And all of the ladies that other ladies that he took photographs of all looked like May, his wife. Here's a similar one of M. Hill. When I originally saw this, I assumed it was May, because they're very similar. You might remember the profile photograph early on. But in this case, this is another attempt by him, and it's on a broken glass plate, which this to me indicates that he was actually, what he was doing, he was every time he wouldn't make one plate, make a positive and a negative on a different sides, etc., etc. So he was doing all this, but mainly for his own view. He wasn't a professional photographer. He wasn't even a member of a society. He wasn't showing it to anyone else. This is just from the loose notes, and this relates to the military tradition. This says at the top of cupboard, half plate. And here we have a HPM SGDS 1881, and down below Coldstream Group 1881. This is the Scots Guards Group, and he has HPM written on it, and I believe that's him at a much younger age about 30, in the middle with the moustache. I'm a bit thrown by this, because this is a 3¼ by 3¼ He could have made this for a projection. He was very proud of his British military history, and that's why I went through all that stuff about being Anglo-Irish at the beginning. This was something which was, by the way, we in Ireland regard these people as being both Irish and British. Just to clarify that, if we can regard people as such. But I believe that that's himself. The question is whether he made this from a half plate. The next one here with the Coldstream Group leads me to believe that these may have been purchased. Here is called the Colours Coldstream Group. Here it's by W. Gregory of the Strand. There was a tradition back then of photographers who went into British military barracks and took photographs of the soldiers for the soldiers and for their families and friends. But there was also at the time, even back then, a burgeoning tourist industry in London. And these would sell because these are the kind of pictures that people say is, and even today, there are souvenirs of London which are featured like this. You're probably wondering where are his photographs. This is one of his photographs here. It's a full plate negative. It may be Colons. I haven't been really able to trace this back to the book. There are years of work to be gone through here, but you will recognize Strokestown House behind. There's May, his wife, with her narrow waist. She must have used great corsets. She always, in a lot of the pictures, she has a very narrow waist with her bicycle. I love this photograph, even though there are flaws in it. For example, if you pull back, the tree on the left could have been got into focus. And also, the shooting at F-16, those sheep who are busy eating grass, etc. But I think it's a lovely image with the sheep in front, with May, that big house, and also the framing of the tree. I actually think it's a very nice photograph. He used to like take landscapes. There was landscapes in Britain and in Ireland. The Pakenham Hall, which is in Tullynally in County Westmeath, needs some photographs of those as well. So here we have something with a kind of a big story about it. Here on the left side, you'll see Olive and Lettice with a circle around it, and then beneath it, O&L, finger in mouth. So there's a bit of an explanation required for this. Here's the context. Olive Pakenham Mann, who you've seen as a child, in 1914, she was 20 years old, and she married a chap called Captain Edward Charles Stafford King Harmon, July 1914. He was maybe 2 or 3 years older than her. He was 23 or 24. He went off to serve the Crown in First World War and died a few months later in November 1914 at Ypres. It took some time to actually find this out. Olive had become pregnant, and the child was born in April 1915. And that's the baby with finger in mouth we saw mentioned earlier. The important thing about this is that inheritance was very important among people in those days. And in fact, there are examples of people adopting not only their name, a double barrel name of their husband, but also the husband also adopting the wife's name. In this particular case, the baby Lettice was a girl, which meant that she could not inherit the Rockingham estate. And Olive had moved to Rockingham, but had come back to Strokestown after it had been discovered that Henry was definitely dead. He was blown to smithereens by a German shell, but took several months to find out. So let's go through the story. Here is the baby with finger in mouth, which is referred to in the notebook. There's a very nice oval mask on this, and it's a very nice picture, except that Olive looks a bit morose, but she just lost her husband and had this baby. So let's move on. Here's the one with the circular mask. Now, the circular mask is badly done, unlike some of the earlier circular masks or masks we had seen. And this is obviously cut out quickly. And we can also see the easel in the background. So when I was going through these, the archivist curator, there is a man called William Fagan. He's no relation of mine, but he's a great guy. And when I just asked, I said, which house was this taken in? Was this taken in Strokestown, or was it taken in Roscommon House, the house of King Harmon? By the way, there was a settlement afterwards for the child and for Olive as a result of this. And Martin just walks away. And he produces this. And of course, the original here was taken by a London photographer, Weston of Sloane Square. The baby had been brought to London for the summer season of 1915. The work which Henry did was done in September 1915, but this photograph was probably taken around July 1915 when they were in London. And it's J. Weston and Sons of Sloane Square. Beautifully taken in a beautiful card, which opens with the photograph inside. So the question is, what was he doing? First of all, here's the masked one as a negative plate. He added this circular one. He was trying to do maybe a bit like what he had done earlier for May, his wife, and of his daughter and his grandchild. I don't know. It's crudely done. Here's the other negative, which was done with the oval mask. And the first thing we'll all notice here is that he's touched up the hair. In the Western photographs, Olive's hair is rather darker than it was naturally, and he's put more contrast and texture into her hair with the touch up here. And the oval mask was on some of the original prints, which had come from Weston. So here's a print produced by Henry in Strokestown from the previous negative. And what's important here is to just think about the context of the time. First of all, the family would have wanted to share these images of their grandchild and of their daughter. Even though this picture was taken away from home, it was beautifully taken by a professional photographer. I doubt very much that Henry, looking at his other photographs, that he ever could have managed his standard. But these would have been sent around, presumably to family and friends, and shown to people here in Ireland. He could have ordered more from Weston and Sloane Square, but photography was his hobby, and this is something that he wanted to do. And of course, there was no 1-hour photo in Strokestown. In fact, there was probably no professional photographer for many, many miles around. So to summarize the characteristics of his printing and copying, it was all done in the middle of the day, as I said. All of the photographs which are in the book are taken with a photographic taking lens. There's no use with an enlarger that I can detect here at all. It's using Grubb, Dalmar, Watson, Gores, etc. There is a Lancaster enlarger from 1905 in the gentleman's study. There's no evidence that it was used, and they didn't have electric power until 6 years later, so I think it was a later edition. He always noted the plate type and size. Exposure times are much larger than outdoors, as I said earlier. Chemicals are sometimes mentioned, but not always. And obviously, he was using the printing and copying easel. So when I saw the book initially, my thoughts had turned to the use of solar camera. And there's another reason why they had turned to that as well. Here you'll see a condenser lens in the window. This is by Monkhaven from the 1860s, with light coming through an already developed plate and it being projected onto a board either for projection or for printing purposes. However, he wasn't doing that. He was actually photographing prints. So he was doing almost the opposite of this. Here's another image from the 1860s by Monkhaven, which shows a solar camera, and there's a mirror outside. Now, there was that reference earlier to a slide, 2 minutes, etc. Whether that meant that he was producing a print using it, I don't know. But one thing he did have was this. This is a very large condenser lens, which fits in the window of the darkroom. Very, very heavy frame and very heavy glass in this. I've decided to be safe and photograph it on the floor. There's still further research to be done here as to whether or not he was condensing and beaming around and using mirrors. However, a very learned friend of mine who is on this call this morning has actually posited that if you reverse that, you could actually diffuse the light, and therefore you wouldn't get sharp shadows or anything like that. He also convinced me, however, that the photographs which were mentioned in the book and which are, I've shown you here, were actually taken in the gentleman's study, because we were there around between 1 o'clock and 3 o'clock in the day. And I put in 1 and 2 ISO into my smartphone exposure app, and I was getting somewhat similar exposure times the ones that Henry was using. His exposure was always very good, by the way, and indeed as was his chemical work. So as for printing, there's loads of these around the house, printing frames. The one thing I don't know, and I haven't really gone into it, is to whether he used printing out or developing out paper. I suspect it was the latter. I couldn't find anything like this either. I found one of these in Dublin in the Photograph Society of Ireland collection, which is a contemporary Griffin's enlarger, in which you would need a transparent medium, either a plate or a negative to go in one end, and then whatever you were doing at the other end, whether it was paper or producing another plate. But there was no sign of anything like this in Strokestown other than that 1905 enlarger I've just mentioned. So I mentioned film, and I'm just coming to the end now. Here, this is from 1899, and there's a reference here to Fitch film half plate. And he notes that his sensitometer is 19, which is WWO speed, Ratton and Wainwright ordinary speed. He may have been using this. He refers there on the very far right-hand side of the page. He refers to old spoiled plates. So he may have been using Fitch film, because some of his earlier plates had expired. We need to find these negatives. They're probably filed away in Strokestown with the negatives. So it may be a bit of fun trying to find them, but they will be extra large and should be easy enough to spot. So while I was messing around down below, I found this packet here. Fitch's original flat, thickly coated negative xylenite films, sensitometer number 30. This has written on the other side of it, July 1900, which may indicate that beyond 1898-99, that he may have continued to use xylenite films. However, in the 19-teens, as late as 1918, he was still using plates, and the same types of plates that he was using in the 1890s. The remarkable thing is that his process over a 30-year period between 1890 and 1920 hardly changed at all. This was the one little blip. As I began trying to get information, just like the Burton's notebook, trying to get information on the Fitch's xylenite film is actually quite difficult. This is the only thing that I've actually come up with here. And this is an ad from Watson's from 1894. And I know they had this film from about 1890. For Fitch's improved xylenite films, a perfect substitute for glass, flexible, unbreakable, and reliable. And then there was a price list. They were quite expensive. Even his were the specially thick ones, but they were 3 and 6pence per dozen for a quarter plate size. And it says here the thin ones are usually supplied and required to be backed by a piece of cardboard in the dark slide. The thick are stout enough to require no backing. He used the thick side. And then there was Pyro Developer, and that you could make up, indicating what you needed for those ounces, water, ammonium, etc., usual fresh hypo fixing. So you had all the information there from Watson's. He used Watson projects a lot. In fact, his suppliers were in Dublin, in the US, and in Britain. In fact, he had a massive amount. There's still a massive amount of stuff that he ordered there today. So to wrap up then, he was a good photographer, maybe not a great photographer. He had good darkroom skills. He liked to innovate with existing technology rather than new technology. He wasn't a person who easily adopted new developments. His notebooks deal with his darkroom work and not his general photography. In other words, photographs that he made in his darkroom. And he often made positive and negatives together. As for his collection of chemicals, he's probably like a lot of us today who have far more equipment than we actually use. There's potential for much more research, and this is what I'd like input on. I mean, for example, one is to look at the photographic negatives. The other one what I think is important, which is probably takes away from pure photography, is actually to look at particularly those images that I've shown you today of the family, and particularly the ones of Olive and the baby, is to what extent this is those photographs, those images are referred to in family literature, as it were, like letters or diaries or other notebooks, because they're all there and there's a complete archive there. And the question is, for example, are any references to those photographs, to what Henry had done with them, and maybe sending them around to friends and relations here in Ireland. So that's it. Thanks for listening.